Hello and welcome to this revision video on the medieval period of crime and punishment. So first of all, we need to think about what life was like in medieval England, so between 1250 and 1500. Society was very hierarchical. Most people were poor peasants who worked the land, owned by a member of the gentry, the landowning class. Above the gentry, small percentage of the population, there is the king and the nobility. So a very, very small number of people. They are very, very wealthy landowners, and basically they make all kinds of decisions about how society is run. For the vast majority of the population, they are illiterate, they can't read and write, and have no formal education. Their homes and their housing was very, very basic. They didn't have lots of possessions. They didn't have very much in their homes. So really that didn't affect crime and theft because there was nothing in their homes to take or to steal. For most people, they rely on the land for their food and their work. In times of famine or bad weather or poor harvests, the crime rate rose because there was no other way of gaining access to food or to work. The church also had huge influence over people in medieval England, particularly on moral issues, telling people how to live a good, holy and godly life. So the church very critical of certain behaviours, particularly things like drinking and gambling and prostitution, and the church prosecuted crimes like that as well. So we break each section into crime, law enforcement and punishment. So first of all, crime that was common in medieval England. What did crime look like in medieval England? Well, serious crime was similar to what we would expect today. So things like murder and large-scale theft of over goods worth 18 pence or more was classed as large-scale theft. Those crimes carried the death penalty. Something that scared many people were outlaw gangs. So these are bands of men who don't live in a particular town or village, who basically just roam the countryside, live in the forest, live in kind of uncontrolled, ungoverned areas, who attack travellers, who will break into towns to steal and kill people who get in their way. So people were terrified of these outlaw gangs. Most crime in medieval England, though, is what we would class as petty crimes, so small-scale, non-violent crimes. The most common crime in medieval England was non-violent petty theft, so small-scale thefts, the thefts of food or small items from wealthier people's homes. It wasn't just the poor, though, that committed crime in medieval times. There were crimes of the wealthy as well. So the wealthy often had their own sort of private armies. These were called retainers. And the wealthy were able to kind of deal with their own disputes and feuds amongst each other by using their own private armies. So very common was violence kind of orchestrated and paid for by the wealthy between rival landowners and rival groups of retainers. So another big problem in medieval times was the high homicide rate. Homicide is just the word for a murder, and there's some reasons why we can explain this. If we just look at statistics from medieval times, it looks like there was a huge kind of wave of violent crime and murders that went on. But actually that wasn't really the case. There's some fairly simple ways that we can explain why this homicide rate was so high. First of all sudden deaths were reported to the coroner. So if somebody died unexpectedly, that went down as a homicide. Okay, so if people died from, say, a fall or an accident, that would be classed as a homicide. Suicide also goes down as a homicide. We can also think about the way that people lived their lives. The fact that most people were peasant farmers who farmed a strip of land surrounded by their neighbours. So understandably, it wasn't difficult for arguments to break out and disagreements and disputes between different peasants. Peasants usually had farming tools to hand, which could very easily be used as weapons. So arguments could very easily spill over into violence. If we combine the use of these weapons with the poor medical care that there is in medieval times, often these assaults or attacks led to somebody dying, mainly because wounds became infected, and without the proper medical attention and care that we have today, people were much more likely to die of an attack or an assault than they would be today. So all of this feeds into the reason why there's a high homicide rate in medieval times. So in medieval times there were other serious crimes that we haven't mentioned yet, as well as some new crimes that started to emerge in this time period. One of the new types of crime that emerged in this time period was something called vagrancy. So this was when usually men moved from town to town or village to village in search of work. This became particularly common after the Black Death, which hit England in the late 1340s, where people out of desperation sought higher wages or better conditions elsewhere. This was illegal, mainly because it challenged the authority and the order of control that the wealthy landowners had, if people were able to move around and argue and fight for better pay or conditions. The image on the screen refers to another new type of crime to emerge in medieval England called scolding. So this was public speech that was seen as abusive or offensive. Now, the vast majority of cases of this were women who were tried and convicted of scolding, representing potentially some of the more sexist views of society at that time, that potentially an opinionated woman or a woman who is prepared to argue against males would be looked down upon and seen as some kind of dangerous person who needed to be punished. Treason, the crime of plotting or planning to overthrow the king or challenge the king's authority, very, very serious crime. Counterfeiting also becomes much more common in this time period, people making fake coins or clipping coins, so taking little bits of the edge off coins to melt it down and sell the precious metals out of it. So this again is a very, very serious crime that carried a very serious punishment. The church was particularly interested in the crime of heresy, so criticism or speaking out against the church or denying the church's teachings was very harshly punished by church courts. So our second section to look at is law enforcement. So law enforcement are the people who are responsible for making sure that the law is followed, the people who chase down, track down and punish criminals and people who break the law. So overall responsibility is with the king. He is responsible for keeping what's called the king's peace, and it's his responsibility overall to ensure that law is followed in medieval England. In each county, the king appoints a sheriff who is in charge. That's his representative in each county. The sheriff was usually a powerful lord who often took a share of the property of convicted criminals. So sheriffs were unpaid, but this was a way of them earning money. As well as that, we have parish constables, so another type of law enforcement officer. They had to ensure that their parish, their local area, responded properly to crime, and they were also expected to keep a group of trained men ready to be called up to the army or to form a posse, which I'll talk about more in a moment. We also got chief constables of the 100. So 100 again is a medieval way of breaking up the country into areas of literally around about 100 people. They supervise their local area, and again they had responsibility for making sure that every man was ready to take up arms and support the king if needed. They were usually wealthy farmers who again could take a share of profits when people were fined for committing crimes. A huge amount of responsibility they fell on ordinary people. We're still hundreds of years away from the first professional police force, at this point in history. So ordinary people have a huge amount of responsibility. First of all, they form things called tithings. So people are in groups of 10. It's your responsibility to make sure that other people in your tithing, the other 9 people who are in your tithing, follow the law. If people don't, if people break it, it's your responsibility to report them, to stop them, or if they run away after committing a crime, to hunt them down and chase after them. You can be fined if you don't do this. People are also expected to take part in the hue and cry. So if somebody sees a crime being committed, they raise the alarm, they shout out that a crime is being committed. It's the responsibility then of everybody else who hears that alarm to start shouting as well, to warn people of what is going on. And ideally, the people should then try and stop the criminal getting away and arrest them. If that fails and the criminal does get away, the parish constable can send out a posse. This is a group of armed men whose job it is to hunt down the escaped criminal. In towns, towards the end of this time period, the end of the medieval time periods, towns as they're growing increasingly begin to employ night watchmen, men whose job it is to patrol the town at night and make sure that there's no criminal activity going on and there's nobody entering the town who shouldn't be there. Second part of law enforcement is when we look at the medieval courts. There's various different courts that are used for different types of crime. The most powerful court in the country is the Royal Court, the King's Court, and what the Royal Court does is it sends out judges to travel the country and visit each part of the country twice a year. Their responsibility is to try the most serious cases. So here we'd be looking at treason, looking at murders, very, very serious crimes would be tried by the Royal Court. More local crimes or less important crimes more locally would have been tried by the 100 courts that were run by justices of the peace. So these were law enforcement officials employed to run court sessions on more small scale crimes in the local area. Justices of the peace began to run these sessions 4 times a year, hence the name quarter sessions. So people had to wait for the next quarter session for their trial to be carried out. Peasants could be tried in a manor court. So these were courts run by the lord of the manor, the local landowner whose land you worked on. So if you were a peasant on his land, you had to obey his rules and his laws. If you didn't, you could be tried in the manor court, and again an appropriate punishment decided by the lord of the manor rather than the government or the king was applied to you. And in towns, borough courts are in session there to try petty crimes in towns, as people there were freemen, so they didn't live and work on somebody else's land. They lived on their own land and then their own housing. So therefore, borough court was there for petty crimes committed by people in towns. And finally, we have church courts. The church courts were responsible for punishing heresy or moral crimes, so things like gambling, sex outside marriage, things that would concern the church and go against Christian teachings. The church had its own court to try and punish people for those types of crimes. Juries in medieval trials were particularly interesting because they usually knew the accused very well. That's totally different today, where a trial in this country today, the jury cannot have any connection to the person who is on trial. Juries usually spent a lot of time researching the case beforehand, and when I say research here, I mean asking people about what might have happened. So there's no like proper weighing up of evidence here. It's just often hearsay and what kind of people's opinions are of what went on. Cases usually were very, very quick. Juries kind of arrived at the court knowing what their verdict was, and it was basically just to pass sentence. Crimes and trials usually were over within around 20 minutes. And surprisingly, juries were often quite lenient. They were quite soft in terms of their sentencing, mainly because of the fact that they often knew the people who were on trial or their families, but also because they didn't want to hand out very, very strict, harsh punishments that the crimes often carried. So the final part that we need to look at is medieval punishments. So fines are the most common type of punishment. These were collected by the officials that we mentioned before, so people like the parish constables and the sheriffs and the chief constables. They collect that money instead of receiving the payment for their work. Punishments were often focused around public humiliation, so you have things like the pillory that you can see here in the picture, where a person's head and hands are clamped into a wooden block. The public can then go and see them, throw things at them, laugh at them, mock them, to humiliate them. The stocks, very, very similar, except this clamps people's feet. The cooking or ducking stool was where people were dunked into water and held underwater, so a particularly unpleasant punishment there, and quite a dangerous one too, that could make people sick from the filthy water they would inhale. Jails in this time were not particularly common as a form of punishment. They were used mainly to house people who hadn't been able to pay off debts that they owed. Only when people had paid off their debts would they be released from prison. Conditions in jails were very, very poor sanitation, a lack of kind of supplies or food for the prisoners, and in fact they had to pay the jailer for anything that they needed. So if you were in prison in this time and you needed food or a blanket or clothing, you had to pay the jailer to bring that for you. So jailers had quite a lot of power over the people that they were in charge of. The death penalty was used for the most serious crimes. Hanging is the most common form of the death penalty in medieval times for things like murder and large-scale theft. There's no kind of way of making the person sort of die quicker here in this time with hanging. It was common for people to be on the rope for several minutes, slowly being suffocated to death. So a pretty horrible way of executing people. Even more gruesome was when people were hung, drawn and quartered. This was used for people convicted of treason. So hanged by the neck, but whilst people are still alive, they're quartered. A cross is cut into their torso. Their insides are then pulled out. Often they're burned in front of them. So a horrific way of torturing people. And also in some places there's local variations on it as well. So there's examples of people being buried alive, there's examples of people being burned alive, there's examples of people being thrown off cliffs, there's examples of people being chained up on the coastline, waiting for the sea to come in and drown them. So punishments for the most serious crimes were incredibly brutal and gruesome. And the final thing to think about is how people were able to escape the death penalty. So if people were going to be sentenced to death, there were some ways that you could get out of it. The most obvious way was to run, to get away, to get out of the town or the village that you are from. If people could manage to do that, usually their chances of avoiding capture were pretty good if they could actually get away in the first instance. Many people chose then to join an outlaw gang, living a life of crime, stealing and robbing to survive. You could try and seek sanctuary, and that's what the photograph shows. If you could get yourself to a church or cathedral, they had to provide you shelter, and you could then stay there for 28 days. After that, you were allowed to be exiled and leave the country without being put to death. You could be hopeful and hope that the jury is on your side, is friendly, is people you know, and that they will choose to acquit you and let you go. You could refuse to plead. If you didn't say whether you're innocent or guilty, you were taken back to jail. Although, as I've just explained in the previous slides, conditions in jail were pretty horrific, but it is a way of delaying execution. If you're wealthy, you probably have powerful friends, so potentially a member of the gentry, a noble, a lord, somebody who is able to have a word with the judge and set you free. You could buy a pardon from the king. Again, this is only an option though for wealthy people, and the king would forgive you. For females, you could be pregnant, and that would not necessarily remove the death sentence, but it would certainly delay it until you had seen the pregnancy through. You could claim benefit of the clergy. So if you're a member of the clergy, if you're a priest or a monk, you could actually say that you want to be tried instead in a church court rather than any other type of court. This usually saw people given a less severe punishment and rarely given the death penalty. And the final option was to become a king's approver. So this meant that people could offer to report on other people, on 10 other people, 10 other criminals. If those people were then arrested and found guilty, you would be let go. So by being a king's approver, you could report on other people to save yourself, basically. And that is the end of our first section on medieval crime and punishment. Thank you for watching.